Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jessica Porras, Senior Manager for Education and Policy at CAQH CORE. Welcome to our webinar titled Enhancing Industry Interoperability, CAQH CORE Connectivity Operating Rules. Next slide, please. This is what we're going to be covering during the webinar. First, we're going to have a core overview and also an update of our efforts proposing some rules for NCVHS consideration. Then we'll talk about our existing connectivity rule requirements. After that, we'll have a presentation on our current connectivity rule updates, followed by some time for Q&A. Next slide. I'd like to share a couple logistics items with all of you. The first is you can access our handouts right now. If you see on the right side of your panel where it says handouts, you can click on there and access our slides. But we will be sending the slides and the recording to you probably sometime tomorrow. So you'll be able to access that. And we always post this information on the website a day or two later. So no worries, you can access this information. And the other thing I'd like to share is feel free to send your questions during the webinar. We'll definitely save some time at the end of the webinar to take some of those questions. Next slide. I'd like to thank our speakers for being here with us today, in particular Patrick Murda from Humana, who's joining us today. He's the Chief Interoperability Architect and Fellow at Humana, and he also co-chairs our CAQH CORE Connectivity and Security Work Group. Thank you, Patrick, for being here with us today, and we're also happy to have CAQH CORE Director Bob Bowman, as well as CAQH CORE Manager Emily Tenake. And I probably said your name wrong. I'm very sorry, Emily, but we're happy to have them with us here today. And now let's get started with our first presentation from CAQH CORE Director Bob Bowman. Welcome, Bob.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon. And we would like to provide just a quick update and overview before we get into the meat of the presentation this afternoon. So on slide 6, you'll see our typical background of an organization that is really a mission and vision driven organization. We are an industry-led group that has over 130 participants that work together to facilitate discussion on addressing some of the most challenging aspects of system integration, standards, operating rules, interoperability, and also the alignment of administrative and clinical activities. Many of you may know that we have been designated by HHS as the authoring entity for operating rules for standards to ensure that the transactions and interactions between a provider and a health plan can be more automated, smoother, and cheaper to actually produce and interact with. So again, our role is to help identify those very specific challenges and how we can overcome them with operating rules. We'll go over exactly what those are in just a moment. But again, we are multi-stakeholder. We do work within the organization. We are made up of the industry. The industry works with us as we identify those challenges and come up with solutions. Again, we work with providers, clearinghouses, health plans, vendors, associations, and our board is comprised of those members as well. So again, we try to have our direction is often brought to us by our board members who are suffering and experiencing those challenges themselves. And we work together with the larger industry to, again, help mitigate many of those challenges with technology, with consensus, and with data content, all the things we really need to help drive the industry forward. On the next slide, on slide 7, you'll see that we do have sets of operating rules for every HIPAA mandated transaction or provider interaction that may occur between a provider and a health plan. We do have these kind of rules set up as what we call infrastructure. So it kind of identifies the roles and responsibilities between providers and health plans. So if a provider submits an eligibility transaction, here's what the provider should expect to receive through the response and how they should receive it and what the SLAs are and the turnaround times. Those are some ideas of what our infrastructure rules really allow for, right? Identification of roles and responsibilities, ensuring that systems and applications meet those roles and responsibilities between trading partners. Another component of our operating rules is data content, and we have written and drafted data content rules for some of the transactions, including eligibility, remittance advice, and prior authorization. There are other types of rules that we've written as well, but more importantly, and for the focus of today's conversation, is our connectivity rules. We've drafted over the last 15 years 3 separate connectivity rules. Again, as you can imagine, as technology has changed over the years and security and authentication has, the operating rules have maintained and kept up with the pace of that change. And so we have a version 1, a version 2, and a version 3 of our operating rules. So our discussion today will focus on what our past work was, what our current work is, and what we think the future might be as well. As you can imagine, there's a little side note there. Our end goal is really to have a single connectivity rule across all the rule sets, because now it is kind of a bifurcated process. HHS requires versions 1 and 2 for some of the transactions and have recommended version 3 for other transactions. So it does make for a little bit of confusion, both with the industry as well as us developing future connectivity rules. So again, the intent is to have that single connectivity rule across all of the transactions, making it much easier for trading partners. Again, that triad of vendors, providers, and health plans to ensure that they can conduct business as seamlessly as possible, get the data that they need to make those transactions work the best way that they can, right, and to interoperate. If we go to the next slide, we do want to provide a quick update as well on the rule package that has been sent to NCAHS and HHS for consideration. In February of this year, the CORE board wrote a letter to NCAHS proposing 3 different rules. One is the prior authorization data content rule. The other is the infrastructure rule related to prior authorizations, and also for the connectivity rule, the version 3, as I mentioned before, for connectivity. The board proposed this rule package for federal mandate for a host of reasons, but the 3 primary are that the prior authorization rules address the pressing need to improve automation and timeliness of prior authorization process. The connectivity rule addresses security, promotes uniformity across the administrative transactions. Again, looking for this rule to be used across all of the HIPAA mandated transactions, not just a few of them. The operating rules set the stage for future operating rules, right? To ensure that as we look at the needs for prior authorization and the needs for claims, the needs for the attachments that are often used to process both claims and prior authorizations, that clinical data can be supported. And also looking towards the future for new technologies as well. In June, CORE sent a letter updating NCAHS on the restructuring of the operating rules and the impact on the rule set. So again, all those letters are available on our website. There will be a hearing of NCAHS later in August 25th and 26th in Washington, D.C. Public comments may be submitted until this Friday on July 24th. So if you have interest in what this rule package means for you as a constituent within the industry, please feel free to submit public comments to NCAHS as well. Now back to the highlights for today's presentation. If we can go to the next slide on slide 9, we want to give you just a quick overview of kind of where we're at, right? The connectivity and security work groups and subgroups have been working over the last 15 years, again, to ensure that HIPAA transactions can be conducted efficiently, securely, and ensuring that through different sets of operating rules for connectivity. So we do have, and these have been published a while now, 2008, for versions 1 and 2. They are federally mandated today for very specific transactions, for eligibility and claim status transactions, and those are what are required. Version 3, for example, is what we currently have before NCAHS for consideration. This would be for all HIPAA mandated transactions, and CORE has proposed this to replace the previous versions because, again, it is more secure. It allows for better security standards. It allows for very specific metadata. It allows for very specific, more robust authentication. So Having that ensures the industry is kept up to speed and up to date with those current standards. We are also currently working, as we often do, on future potential updates to connectivity. So there's some work that is going on today that Patrick and Emily will work through and talk through later on this afternoon, is to address some of the new things that we are considering under development. Again, this will also apply for all transactions, including claim and PA attachments. So again, adding in attachments or any potential attachment standards is going to be very important for us as we consider the future. Again, we do want to continue that support for clinical administrative data exchange. These updates help us do that. So again, this is not final rule. It is still being drafted. The work groups are working together on what this may look like. And the core board may propose this in the future. But that is a little ways away, as you can imagine, as we are still developing and drafting those rules. So again, we will continue to maintain and update the core rules at regular intervals over time. Again, it's part of our roadmap to continue this work. With that, I'll hand the call over to Emily to get into some of the details related to the connectivity rules. Emily?
Thanks, Bob. So what we want to do now is provide some more details of those existing CAQH CORE connectivity rule requirements. On the next slide, here we see that connectivity is a generic term that we use in the industry for how computers, networks, information systems all connect to facilitate data access and exchange. There are a wide variety of protocols and standards in use within our industry, which over the years, many of you know, has resulted in this kind of hodgepodge in the way data is moved around. The core connectivity rules consist of several of these key components or features of connectivity that you see here on the image on slide 11. And where core connectivity rules address these components, they really act as a framework for connectivity that also allows for some flexibility. For example, core connectivity has developed rule requirements around a safe harbor, which is a concept that the core participants developed and establishes a common way to conduct an administrative transaction, meaning stakeholders really able to quickly set up connectivity for any trading partner that wishes to conduct a transaction. Again, this is just one example. You'll see examples for each of the key features listed in the diagram here, many of which are included in our core connectivity rules. As we move to the next slide, we see that there are different levels of interoperability. So foundational interoperability is the capability of a system to transfer data to and from another system, and is really where we see the core connectivity requirements focus. So this level includes many of the features we saw on the previous slide, including network, transport protocol, transport security, authentication, message interactions, and web services, along with some examples of each of those. This foundational level then supports the other levels of interoperability, such as structural, semantic, and organizational. Structural interoperability really refers to the capability to preserve the original makeup of the data, also known as the payload, and as it moves between systems. There are several different types of payloads, including, but not limited to, external payloads, PDFs, docs, and more. Semantic interoperability refers to the ability of systems to enter data exchange using agreed upon data or code sets, such as LOINC codes. And finally, organizational interoperability refers to the policies and governance needed to support the exchange of that data. Again, the core connectivity rules are really focused on that foundational aspect of interoperability, which then in turn supports the other levels of interoperability. Next slide, please. So here we see a comparison of the stages of the core connectivity rules that have existed over time that Bob referred to. So version 1, version 2, and now version 3 of the core connectivity rules. As many of you know, prior to core connectivity, trading partners often define their own connectivity requirements, and that frequently resulted in the lack of uniform connection standards and some proprietary protocols. So with that first version of core connectivity requirements, we established HTTPS over the public internet as a vehicle for the conduct of the eligibility transaction. Then with version 2, this was expanded with a set of requirements that was, again, really specific to the transactions being conducted and included the use of SOAP and MIME message envelope standards, username and password, and digital certificate for authentication. And it also specified message envelope metadata. So what version 3 does, which is highlighted, boxed here in red on the right-hand side, is that it requires support for SOAP for web-based services with specific metadata, message structure, and error handling requirements. So it comes down to one message envelope required rather than 2, which we saw in version 2. It also requires the use of SSL 3.0 or optionally TLS 1.1 or higher, and requires only digital certificate for authentication, which is important because this is a more secure method than just using username and password, which was removed as a requirement in this third version. So as Bob mentioned, these requirements are included in the rule package that the board proposed for federal mandate and apply to prior authorization, as well as applying backwards to all the existing mandated operating rules that exist. Again, with the adoption of this version of the core connectivity rules, we would sunset those prior versions. Next slide, please. So just want to go over a few of the benefits of version 3 over core connectivity version 2. And some of those include, first, that there's a single SOAP plus WSDL envelope standard in place of the 2 SOAP envelope standards that existed in the second version. So this really establishes a more robust and uniform support for handling payloads using SOAP, both in batch and real-time processing modes. This version, again, also improves security by requiring digital certificates and removing the more vulnerable security method of username and password. It also provides additional support, not just for prior authorization, but also goes backward, again, to provide support for transactions relative to previous rules, such as eligibility and claim status. And as a result, organizations will only have to support one safe harbor connectivity method for all the adopted operating rules, rather than supporting multiple connectivity methods that apply to specific transactions. So that's really key here. So under the safe harbor, which I touched upon a few times now, vendors, clearinghouses, providers, and plans are all ensured that there will be one connectivity method that will be supported by all HIPAA-covered entities. So these entities can really be assured that there's a common understanding for how this information will be exchanged. It's important, though, that the rule with the safe harbor does not require for entities to remove existing connections. So if organizations agree through their trading partner agreements to exchange using prior methods or different methods, that's still allowed. This does not remove that. And finally, the rule enhances communication of errors with updated error codes. Next slide, please. So here we just want to focus a little more on the concept of the safe harbor, since it really is a key component of core connectivity. Again, we see that using the internet as the delivery option establishes a safe harbor connectivity method that entities know will be supported. So this creates one mechanism everyone can trust will be there to exchange information at the time of the request, but still enables trading partners to use different communication and security methods if that's agreed upon. And with that, I will pass it to Jessica for our first polling question.
Thank you so much, Emily, and also Bob, for your presentations. So yeah, let's take a pause of presentations to take a polling question. This question is a select all that apply. So the question is, which CAQH core connectivity benefits are most important to your organization? Your options are reduces complexity, improves security, additional transaction standard support, safe harbor, and improve messaging and error reporting. So I will give the audience just a few more seconds to respond to the question, and then let's go ahead and share the results. And I'd love if Bob, what do you think of this response? Is it what you expected?
I think this is definitely on point for what we would expect. Anytime that we can reduce complexity within the industry, especially between providers and health plans, it's that much easier, right? Vendors, clearinghouses can help build software and applications that meet the needs without a lot of complexity, right? No one wants to use eligibility with this system and PAs on that system and go pick up claims with this system. All those different interfaces really drives complexity and burnout and all kinds of negative problems for providers. But even if we get down to the connectivity, right, the components of the connection of how to do this, making it much easier for everybody really helps.
Thanks, Bob. That's a very insightful comment. Let's go to the next slide. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Patrick Murda, who will walk us through the CAQH Core Connectivity Rule update. Patrick?
Thank you, Jessica, and also thanks Bob and Emily, and thanks to everybody for being here today. Let's go to the next slide, please. When the Connectivity and Security Work Group launched in February of this year to update the core connectivity rule requirements that were just presented, three main goals were initially identified. First, we wanted to align the core connectivity rule requirements to help support some of the contemporary frameworks proposed in the CMS and ONC interoperability rules, so that some of the more technical specifications would align with where the industry is headed as it continues to progress. Not only is that based upon the CMS and ONC interoperability rules, but contemporary interoperability models in general are becoming much more prevalent in healthcare. The second was looking at establishing and updating the core connectivity safe harbor requirements and making sure that we are supporting existing technologies such as SOAP, but also looking forward to what is emerging, namely RESTful APIs, to ensure that the safe harbor is able to support both standards that exist today and is flexible enough to support some of the more modern approaches in order to improve interoperability. Finally, as the work group that thought ahead to future core initiatives, particularly with attachments and value-based payment operating rules in the pipeline, we wanted to ensure a single, uniform core connectivity rule is created that supports the intersection of both the administrative and clinical data exchange. Some of the specific updates to the core connectivity rule requirements that the work group is currently in the midst of focusing on include the use of TLS 1.2 or higher for increased security, looking at contemporary authentication and authorization standards. In the current existing connectivity rule, only digital certificates are required for authentication, but there's a lot of movement in the industry for the use of technologies such as OAuth 2 as an authorization standard. We're also adding support for the exchange of attachment transactions to support interoperability between administrative and clinical data exchange. And finally, adding requirements pertaining to REST APIs. As we went over in the previous section, the existing core connectivity rules support the transport of SOAP messages, so the addition of REST would allow for some of the emerging approaches for data exchange to be included in the safe harbor. Next slide, please. Here, you'll see a roadmap of the core connectivity rule updates that are currently in progress. After launching in February of this year, the group identified and agreed to opportunity areas to pursue for the update. The group then developed the updates to the draft requirements by completing a number of feedback forms, straw polls, and participating in discussions. As we near the end of the group's activities, we are working to finalize the requirements and officially move the group to the formal voting process. The formal voting process begins with an official workgroup ballot, which requires quorums and minimal approvals before the update can be passed to each of the next levels of voting and ultimately to the CAQH CORE board for final vote and approval. And I did want to quickly note that as we're packaging these updates together, we're trying to be smart and making sure that as we look across the industry and as contemporary technologies become more prevalent, that we're packaging things in a very appropriate way. Next slide, please. As we've mentioned throughout the webinar today, CAQH CORE proposed to NCVHS that version 3 of the Core Connectivity Rule replace current regulations mandating support for version 1 and 2 for the eligibility and benefits, claim status, and electronic remittance advice, in addition to adding prior authorization in order to promote uniform interoperability requirements across administrative transactions. On this slide, we see that the key existing connectivity requirements included in version 3 of the Core Connectivity Rule that we discussed earlier. These requirements include support for SOAP-based web services with specific metadata, message structure, and error handling requirements, use of HTTPS, SSL 3.0, or optionally TLS 1.1 or higher over the public internet, establishing a safe harbor, and X509 digital certificates. On the right side of the slide, we see updates to these key requirements, which include adding support for the exchange of attachments, sunsetting SSL 3.0 and requiring TLS 1.2 or higher, and adding OAuth 2 as an authorization standard. Again, bringing the model into a more contemporary paradigm. Additionally, to serve as a bridge between the existing and emerging standards of protocols and continue to ensure industry needs are met as technology continues to progress and evolve, there are a number of REST requirements under consideration as part of this update. These requirements include support for REST-style resources for X12 and non-X12 exchanges, such as HL7 CDA and CCDA, PDFs, text, images, and etc. Additionally, the use of JSON to exchange REST messages, support for specific HTTP methods, such as post and get to exchange messages, as well as versioning requirements and standardized API naming conventions are included. Each of these requirements is currently underdeveloped by the workgroup as we continue to modernize the existing core connectivity requirements. As technology is ever-changing and progressing, once the single core connectivity rule is established across all CAQH core operating rule sets, and as being proposed to NCVHS, core participating organizations will continue to update the core connectivity rule to align with current interoperability, privacy, and security standards so that industry needs are met currently and continually. I now hand the call back over to Jessica for a second polling question. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Patrick. So yeah, let's take another moment to hear from our audience. This is a yes or no question. Does your organization use RESTful APIs for data exchange? And your options are yes, no, and no, but plan to implement. So this information is very helpful for us to gauge where the industry's at. So thank you in advance for your participation. So let's go ahead and share these results. And once again, Bob, I'm going to ask you what you think of these responses.
No, it's great. It's good to see that many entities are moving forward with some of the latest technology related to REST. And we are trying to meet the industry need to ensure that there's some consistency in those types of implementations. So again, we welcome folks to join CORE and help us draft the rules, and also to consider them for implementation later on. So it's a great way to see where the industry's at. And maybe Patrick, if you have any comments too on that or not.
Yeah, actually, I do, Bob. That's very encouraging as well. As we kind of hinted on during the discussion throughout the conversation today, most of us, grew up in the world of SOAP, with all of our X12 transactions. But as REST has become more prominent, starting initially in the e-commerce space, but quickly gaining ground in healthcare and other industries because of its more open nature as far as onboarding, the easier to understand constructs and basic ease of use. I find it encouraging that we've got almost 50% that are already using it. We got another 20% that are planning to do it. So that's encouraging and fits well with, I think, where the rule is going.
Yep, definitely. Great point.
Thanks so much. So let's move on to the next slide. We have some time for Q&A. I encourage you to go to the questions panel on the right-hand side and submit your questions. So let's get started. So the first question I think is probably appropriate for Bob. What can we do if we want to submit comments to NCVHS for the hearing on the proposed CAQH CORE operating rules?
Great question. And we do provide a hyperlink in this presentation slide deck for entities to use to find the information of how to do that. So I do advocate that if you have any comments or questions about that process, please visit their website, please submit comments. It really helps them to understand the needs of the industry and where the industry direction should be. I do want to make a clarification. I mentioned that the NCVH hearing would be in DC. It will actually be held virtually. So you can definitely download you can definitely visit the website and be part of the conversation and hear the hearing as the testifiers are presenting. It is public and it is open to the public. So there's ncvhs.hhs.gov website will take you to the specifics of where that information can be found to submit, as well as the dates and times and how to dial in and be part of the virtual discussion.
Thanks, Bob. And I do want to note, we heard from someone on the line who's with NCVHS, and there is also time for public comment during the hearing. So that's another opportunity for folks who want to submit. So the next question, probably top of mind for a lot of people, will the work being done on core connectivity be consistent or conflict with the requirements in the ONC and CMS interoperability rules? Bob, you care to comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. One of our goals and part of our mission and vision actually is to work with the industry and look at the existing standards and build upon them with operating rules with industry consensus. So the core operating rules would not conflict with any sort of existing standards or existing requirements. We actually try to build those into our rule requirements themselves. So we look to where the industry is at, we look to where it's going, we look to other segments of the industry that might be more progressive or already ahead or have already thought out things that perhaps revenue cycle hasn't made it there yet. And so it's a kind of give and take and live and learn, and we try to build upon and rest right on the shoulders of giants who may be ahead of us. So again, we will not conflict with existing standards. We don't duplicate the requirements from existing standards. We will highlight them in our rules and say, hey, use this standard. It is what the industry has accepted, and that consensus-driven approach that we take really helps do that. So yeah, we don't see any need for conflict.
That's great, Bob.
Hey, Bob, just let me add a little bit of color commentary to that. This is Patrick, because I think that's a really, really good question. And just to add a little bit of more color to that is that I think there's also, even before the work group came together, there was certainly an underlying theme or a paradigm in our model that we wanted to ensure that, with the work that this group is doing, is that it took into account, the fundamental progression of technology as it relates to, RESTful APIs and those types of things. So that has been a kind of a foundational component of the thought process of the work group as we're looking at, the modernization of the rule, is how do we ensure that it plays well, that it, it promotes, that it basically rests on the same technology infrastructure and concepts and paradigms and patterns that all of us are doing for the CMS and ONC rule as well. So just want to comment on that, Bob. Thank you.
No, it's great to have that perspective, especially from someone that's implementing it. So thank you, Patrick.
Thanks so much. The next question is, what tools are available if we want to consider implementing Core Connectivity version 3?
That's a great question. And what we try to do as we develop the operating rules, we also develop a certification suite. And what that means is that it's basically a document that lists all of the basic requirements that any specific stakeholder, again, we write them specifically for providers, health plans, clearinghouses, and software vendors, what those requirements are, how they're applicable to that stakeholder type, and then what the expected result would be if you had to actually test this. So folks can use these tools that are all free and publicly available on our website to ensure that they're in conformance with those requirements, again, by stakeholder type. So it's a great tool to use as you're building that out. We also have some more high-level tools, instead of getting down into the weeds of each individual specific requirement for connectivity or even for data content of a specific rule. We do have some gap analysis tools, and these have come in different levels. So really high level, I'll let you do a gap analysis of we don't offer this particular transaction, or we don't offer this particular level of security, right? We're on SSL, but we need to migrate to TLS 1.1. We have a way for you to make an assessment of your own systems and applications to do that. So again, we have a gap analysis tool, we have a certification test suite, and finally, we actually have a certification testing program. You can actually certify your system, your application. You as a health plan can certify your entire enterprise to ensure that you're meeting all the requirements for connectivity, for security, for authentication, for data content, for each of the HIPAA mandated transactions. So again, it really helps to go through that entire process. Testing is free. There's no fee for testing. If you do want to acquire the seal and use that as part of your marketing package, part of your marketing plan to recruit new customers, new clients, it's always helpful, right? We do have a core seal that you can actually pursue and receive the seal for each of the transactions as well. So we have lots of tools. Lots of these resources are free to ensure that your systems meet those requirements.
Thanks, Bob. For the next question, we've actually received several of this similar question, and it's what transactions would have to implement Core Connectivity version 3 if NCVHS approves what Core is currently proposing?
Yep, another good question. And just to be clear, we hope that the slide is clear, and hopefully the context is clear, that version 3 would be used for all HIPAA-based transactions that are under HIPAA. So everything from eligibility, claim status, remittance advice, all 3 versions of the claim, et cetera, prior authorization, enrollment, disenrollment, and transaction and premium payment. So it allows for those vendors that have a whole suite of products to really build and base their applications on one model, one foundational model. Because right now, the rules, as well as how the industry is implemented, it can still be all over the place. So there's still some interoperability issues, right? Again, and going back to what Emily mentioned before, this is a safe harbor. It allows one HIPAA-covered entity to request this model for connectivity from any other HIPAA required entity, right? You can still use your VPNs. You can still use anything that you've already developed and pushed out into the market. But again, you're going to be maintaining that kind of proprietary solution for each one of those implementations. That can be burdensome. Whereas a uniform kind of approach that the Core Connectivity Rule allows for those systems to be built those applications to be built and maintained for all the transactions under one mode for those connections.
Thanks so much, Bob. The next question is, if HHS adopts the V3 connectivity rules, would providing a RESTful API but no SOAP endpoints be acceptable?
It's a great question, and I think it also falls into what is HIPAA compliant versus what is also HIPAA compliant, right? Today, there are specific requirements for HIPAA-covered entities to implement core connectivity versions 1 and 2 for eligibility, claim status, and the remittance advice. There are no HIPAA requirements for any of the other HIPAA-mandated transactions for connectivity. So there's only very specific requirements for SOAP or MIME for eligibility and claim status, and SOAP only for, SOAP and MIME for remittance advice as well. So there's kind of there's a gap within current HIPAA regulations. There's some transactions require very specific connectivity, other transactions there's no requirement. So moving forward with kind of a uniform approach of version 3 connectivity would allow all the transactions to be under one version, so it makes it much easier. But it also does not preclude entities from going off and building RESTful APIs, going off and building FHIR-based APIs. Allows for the industry to continue to grow in those new segments and new technologies. As we saw from the polling and as we heard from Patrick, there are folks using these transactions and understanding this technology way better than we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? So even as the industry takes different approaches with different data types of content requirements and different types of interactions, the mandated transactions are here, right? These are the ones that we all have to implement, these base transactions. How we interoperate them using SOAP or REST or FHIR, that's still available for the entire market to use and consume and understand and make sure that the systems and applications are built to do that. So today, some transactions require SOAP and MIME. Other transactions, there's no requirements.
Thanks, Bob. So the next question, I'm not sure if it's a little inside baseball, but hopefully you can give some sort of response to this question. Are there any plans for CAQH CORE to develop response time and performance requirements for REST APIs?
That's a great question. I'll probably also ask Patrick to weigh in here too. Currently, what the subgroup and what the work group for connectivity has been talking about has some of these components related to REST in it. It is a challenge, right? Because REST is often considered a real-time API, right? The real-time transactions are based here. But how big does REST transactions get, right? If I have a 10,000 line claim, how is that going to work? Or does it work? Or should it work, right? So some of those specifications that are set up and being discussed right now by the work group, and actually will be next week when we have our next call, are going to be important components for us to discuss and make sure that if there are performance requirements or specific response times, or if there are hops from one transaction from a provider, say, through a clearinghouse to a third clearinghouse to the health plan and back out, what should those performance metrics be? How do we ensure that we listen to the industry and build those components? All that's kind of in discussion right now and in development. And should we or shouldn't we do that? The work group's weighing in on that right now.
Thanks so much.
Kind of more to come on that, I think. Patrick, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't want to slow us down, but Jessica, could you can repeat the question again? I want to make sure that I fully understood the.
Of course, Patrick. I do tend to go a little bit too fast sometimes. So the question is, are there any plans for CAQH CORE to develop response time and performance requirements for RESTful APIs?
Oh, got it. Okay, yeah. So yeah, the question was very simple, actually. I made it overly complex in my mind, and I think, that Bob answered it actually very well. I'll just add a little bit more color that, those of us that, do both SOAP and REST, there's not typically or not even a measurable difference in performance. So, to Bob's point, the fact that there tends to be, for some reason that I really can't fully explain, maybe some unfounded bias against maybe RESTful APIs as being able to not handle large transactions or whatever the case may be. We haven't necessarily seen any of that, but as far as the actual specifications and SLAs and that type of thing, I think Bob answered that very well.
Thanks so much. So with that, unless there are any late breaking questions, I think we can go on to the next slide. And I do want to let our audience know, I know that this topic can be very complex. So you can always send us an email or give us a call, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. So this next slide, just wanted to share some of the benefits of joining CAQH CORE as a participating organization. I think probably the most meaningful thing is you get to be a part of these rule development efforts that help change the industry. If you're interested, feel free to contact us. Next slide, please. In addition, there are lots of free resources on our website, so come take a look. We've got lots of tutorials, including one that's going to be up in the next day or so that goes through the requirements that have been proposed to NCVHS. So if you need a refresher, want to learn more, come take a look in a few days. We also have all the material from past webinars, recordings and slides on the website, and tons of FAQs. So please go to our website for more information. Next slide. And then finally, these are our upcoming events. We'll be presenting at the WEDI Forum in about 2 weeks. And then coming up next month, we're excited to share some of our PA case study findings with all of you. Next slide, please. So here is our information if you'd like to check out our website or email us. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. Also, thank you so much to our speakers, especially Patrick, for joining us today. And I hope you all have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.